You are listening to an American Free Press podcast. Joining me on the line is John Rabe, the Director of Creative Production, on-air host for the D. James Kennedy Ministries. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Dave, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
John, I saw something online about D. James Kennedy Ministries filing a lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is based in Montgomery, Alabama, not too far from me here. I want to get into that in great detail in a moment, but before we do, for the benefit of the listeners, could you give them a little bit of background about who you are, what you do for D. James Kennedy Ministries, a little bit about the ministries, and how you got to the point here where you sued the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC?
Sure. Well, to start with who I am, I've been with D. James Kennedy Ministries for about 16 years. We produce two television programs called Truths That Transform and another one called Kennedy Clocks, and those air on a number of Christian television networks all over the country. And the ministry's namesake, D. James Kennedy, some of your listeners will be familiar with him, some will not, but Dr. Kennedy was, and he passed away in 2007, but up until the time of his death, Dr. Kennedy was the most watched Presbyterian minister in the country. He had a nationwide radio program that was carried on hundreds of radio stations, and the television program was carried all over the country. And so Dr. Kennedy was a pastor of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the ministry was a nationwide and really a worldwide broadcast ministry. Dr. Kennedy also is known for starting an evangelism program that's used by many churches even to this day around the country called Evangelism Explosion, which just teaches normal people how to share their Christian faith with their friends, with their neighbors, and with other people that they come into contact with. And so that's still very widely used today. And Dr. Kennedy founded a seminary that operates in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Knox Theological Seminary. That's a Reformed Protestant seminary in Florida, and a number of other ministries as well. So Dr. Kennedy's footprint is a large footprint. And Dr. Kennedy was known for preaching to his congregation, and then those sermons were carried on his television program as well. And he had a very unique way of taking extraordinarily complex issues, theological issues, and of course the Bible speaks to many political issues as well. He had a way of taking extraordinarily complex concepts and explaining them in a way that was easy to understand without watering them down. Because there are political ramifications of things taught in the Bible as well, and Dr. Kennedy preached the whole counsel of God. He preached from the whole Bible. He didn't only pick and choose certain parts of it. He spoke to political issues as well, and that made him, in some corners, controversial because he was willing to talk about things that perhaps not all pastors are willing to talk about. But the fact is that the Bible has lots to say on issues like abortion, on issues like sexuality, which are some of the issues in our culture right now. So Dr. Kennedy spoke clearly about those issues, and he was not afraid of the controversy, but that did put him in the sights of certain groups who don't like the biblical viewpoint on that. So how is it that we come to the point of this lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center? Well, D. James Kennedy Ministries has continued on Dr. Kennedy's mission. We've continued promoting his viewpoints, using his sermons on our television programs, and those issues, as I mentioned, include issues of sexuality. Well, as you probably know, in today's culture, to take a biblical viewpoint on those issues, which is essentially a conservative viewpoint on those issues, will make you very unpopular with those who are intent on really remaking our society upon new lines. Because Dr. Kennedy took a biblical position saying that marriage is God-ordained institution between one man and one woman, which is simply what all Christians at all times have believed over 2,000 years, only until the last decade or so. And because he says that marriage is one man, one woman union, and because we've said that sex is ordained by God, gender is biologically determined. You are born male or female, as the Bible says. It's not infinitely malleable as being taught in our culture. And because the Bible teaches that one can be delivered from a homosexual orientation, what Paul writes to the Corinthians, that there were people who were involved in a variety of different behaviors, including sexuality, and he says such were some of you, but you've been washed, you've been cleansed. Christ has delivered you. So this is just simply biblical teaching. And while we recognize it's not popular with everyone, it's certainly what Christians have taught in all times and all places up until some started compromising very recently in the game. For upholding those views and for broadcasting those views, we have been designated a so-called hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center sets themselves up as sort of the clearinghouse of information on hate groups in America, and so they're frequently quoted by the media. They are often relied upon by law enforcement groups, and they have absurdly characterized us as a hate group and put us on their hate map because of our traditional Christian beliefs on these issues. And it's simply false. It's laughable. It's slanderous. We hate no one. We bear animus towards no one. Our goal in preaching the truth is love, even for those who are ensnared in harmful lifestyles. And so it's just a false charge. And because it's taken seriously by so many, we decided, well, the time has come to act. And thus we filed a federal lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center a few months ago.
Great, John. Thank you for explaining that, and especially the way you did. That's terrific. You know, I see in the complaint that Amazon.com, another entity that wants to snuff out any independent thought or speech, how are they involved in this? Can you explain that to the listeners?
Sure, that's a great question. We did also include Amazon.com in the lawsuit, and on a slightly different basis, Amazon.com has been relying upon the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group designations. Amazon has a charity program called the SMILE program, and anyone who's ever ordered anything from Amazon probably knows how it works. You get a little notification that pops up saying, would you like to donate a very small amount, a few cents of the purchase, to a charity group? And then they have a list of charity groups that you can donate to. Well, we applied to become one of the charity groups, and they refused us entrance into their SMILE program, and the basis that they gave us for it was that you've been designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group, and because you're a hate group, we are excluding you from our Amazon SMILE charity program. We view this as religious discrimination because we have been falsely designated a hate group, as I said, simply for holding traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs on issues like sexuality. And so because of that belief, we're designated a hate group, and now Amazon excludes us from being a beneficiary of their SMILE program. And so this isn't so much a matter of, well, oh, poor us, somebody said something bad about us or someone excluded us from a program. There's enough of that sort of snowflake mentality in our society. This isn't about, well, we got our feelings hurt. What it's really about is a much more pervasive attitude that wants to marginalize and silence conservatives and Christians for holding beliefs that are no longer considered politically correct. Well, in an America where we have a First Amendment, where we are guaranteed that we have the right of free exercise of our religion, those are harmful positions, especially when companies and government and law enforcement relies upon these designations. So we sued the SPLC for making the false designation, and we're suing Amazon for excluding us from a charity program when we are a charity, a Christian charity, excluding us from that program simply because of our religious viewpoint.
Yeah, it's a real disgrace. Thank you for explaining that, John. Now, the lawsuit was filed, if I'm correct, on August 23rd of last year, so really not too long ago. The Christmas season seems to have just come and went like, geez, I don't know what, like a comet. I mean,
right.
I mean, we still have our tree up, so you know, we
the way I look at it is February is when you start looking at taking the tree down. That's plenty.
We got a beautiful tree, so we're going to have it up until at least then. Here, August 23rd, this was a release that came from your organization, a defamation suit against our good friends at the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm always curious, John, about the mainstream media's reaction to things like this. Can you tell listeners about the coverage, if any, that you got from the mainstream media?
Well, thank you. It did receive, especially at the time of the filing, quite a bit of attention in the mainstream media. And of course, the wheels of justice, the wheels of our court system turn rather slowly. So we filed the suit in August. There's still been pretrial hearings and motions and so forth. So there's not a lot of huge news to report since the filing of the lawsuit as we wait for various court dates and go through the discovery process and so forth. But the coverage that we received at the time, I'm actually a little bit surprised, was for the most part pretty fair. The main problem is, though, of course, that when you're dealing with the media, because they are used to accepting the Southern Poverty Law Center's designation, you start from the standpoint of having to explain why you're not, in fact, a hate group. And their coverage will say, hate group as designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So you start off on the footing of being a quote-unquote hate group as you try to explain yourself. But that being said, it does seem that we got some interesting coverage, and just to be honest with you, it turned out to be a little bit fairer, I think, than I expected. And I'm guessing that the reason for that is, and this is the good news, and this is one of the reasons why we filed the suit, the media is starting, and I emphasize the word starting because we're early into it, but they are starting, I think, to get the idea about the Southern Poverty Law Center. They're beginning to recognize that this organization may not just be an unbiased observer that is a clearinghouse on hate groups, that when you're going to designate someone a hate group, there is an ideological consideration that goes into that, and that perhaps that ideological consideration is now sweeping in groups that nobody would agree belongs as being designated a hate group. And so it seems like the mainstream media might be starting to catch on, as are other groups, to the SPLC and recognizing that maybe this group isn't cracked up to be what we think it's supposed to be. And just to give you a little bit of brief history, if I can, in 1971, the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded, and even that comes as news to some people who think, oh, they did great work during the Civil Rights Movement. They were founded after the bulk of the Civil Rights Movement by an attorney named Morris Dees in 1971. Early on, they fought some cases in court against the Ku Klux Klan and others and built their reputation as an anti-hate group organization that will do something about it during that period. However, if you look beyond the early 70s, you will be very hard-pressed to find actual cases of the Southern Poverty Law Center going up against true hate groups and being effective against them. What you instead find is that they've largely built an enormous, and I mean an enormous, fundraising machine in a way that I've explained is that their job is basically to scare Northeastern liberals who have never met a Christian or never met a conservative into thinking that there are hate groups around every corner in order to raise donations. They currently have, and this is not speculation, this is in their own financial filings, they have over $300 million in endowments right now sitting, much of that in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere, but more than $300 million in the bank in endowments. John Stossel of Fox News just a couple of days ago did a YouTube video on the Southern Poverty Law Center that I think is very informative, and I'd urge people to go look for it. Just Google John Stossel, SPLC. But in this video, he points out statements from Morris Dees, the founder, in the late 70s or early 80s, saying, boy, if we could just get an endowment of, I forget what it was now, $10 million or $20 million, we'd be set forever. And then he goes, if we could just get an endowment of $50 million, then we'd have what we need to guarantee this organization for the rest of his existence. Well, now they're up to $300 million, and they're still raking in amounts of money by scaring people with the idea that there are these dangerous and violent hate groups around every corner. They also engage in a fallacy by lumping in groups like ours that simply promote mainstream historic Christian doctrine with actual violent hate groups. And so we all recognize there is such thing as a hate group. There are groups based along racial lines or others will designate people for targeting and will incite violence against those kind of people. Although very interesting to note that radical Islam is largely absent from the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate maps. We've had mosques in America where terrorist attacks have been coordinated in the United States, in Virginia and elsewhere, and yet these mosques do not appear on the SPLC's hate map. So they're very selective about the groups that they choose, and they end up lumping together Christian organizations like the Family Research Council and D. James Kennedy Ministries and the Alliance Defending Freedom, who simply defends the First Amendment in court. They lump them together with groups like neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, which is extremely disingenuous, and they've raised huge amounts of money doing it. So it seems that to some degree, and unfortunately the mainstream media still parrots way too often the SPLC's designations, but there does seem to be sort of a reckoning that's begun. The Atlantic, which is by no means a conservative publication, published a story last year or the year before, the title of which has the Southern Poverty Law Center lost its way. And in that story, they unfold some of the things that we're talking about here, that they've become very left-wing and partisan partisan in their ideology, that they are using scare tactics in order to raise enormous amounts of money that are sitting in offshore accounts. They're paying their executive huge sums, and yet we don't see any actual activity in court, which is their ostensible mission, is to go after hate groups in court. So I think maybe the mainstream media is starting to catch on, and we saw that reflected in some of the coverage of our case.
Thank you again for explaining that the way you did. There are some rays of hope, I think, and that's terrific. Looks like you took out an ad in the Sun Sentinel. Dr. Frank Wright, who's the president and CEO of the ministries, wrote something up here, Confronting Hate and Lies. D. James Kennedy Ministries is not a hate group, and it's a nice little one-page, what they call an advertorial. What kind of response did you get from that?
Well, we got very good response, and the reason that we did that in the Sun Sentinel here in South Florida is because that's our backyard, and the local news had jumped onto this story, and so you have the Southern Poverty Law Center's supposed hate map shows us with a big star on us right here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and lest our neighbors become concerned that, oh my goodness, there's a hate group in our midst, we felt it was particularly important to point out to the people who are adjacent to us that we are in no way a hate group, that even as we uphold the biblical design for marriage and the biblical design for sexuality, whether you're talking about people who are transgendered or homosexuals, we can tell you with authority that we hold nothing but love for people who are in those lifestyles. And our desire is that they can find healing, that there is a better way for them. But we have no desire to see violence done to them. We have no desire to attack them. We have no desire to do anything but reach out in love to them. And so that makes us, by definition, the very opposite of a hate group, and it stretches the word hate far beyond any rational meaning of it. Unfortunately, in our society, we've gotten to the point now where the word hate is being redefined. It used to be one time tolerance was, you and I disagree, but I uphold your right to disagree. Now it's considered intolerant even to disagree. So if you disagree with my behavior, if you disagree with my beliefs, I now label that hate. Well, then everything is hate and everyone belongs on the hate list, or we can no longer rationally disagree with each other, which seems to be what the SPLC is pushing for in all of this. So we wanted our neighbors to know that these designations are false, that they're slanderous, that we're doing something about it, and that we are the farthest thing from a hate group. We are here to support. We are here to help. We are here to love the people in our community, be they straight, be they homosexual, be they transgendered. We are here to love them. And so I think we got a great reaction from it locally, and it was, again, a good opportunity to point out to people, ultimately for us, it's about the gospel of Jesus Christ, that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ on behalf of sinners is available for all of us, and that brings forgiveness before God. That brings transformation into our lives. And I thank God that someone shared that message with me, and I want to share it with others, and that's the farthest thing from hate. And so we wanted to point that out to our neighbors in that ad in the Sun Sentinel.
Excellent. Thank you again, John, for explaining that. And incidentally, I did interview one of the top guys over there at the SPLC, this Mark Potok, and I asked him specifically about hate. And I said, isn't really hate a subjective term? It's really not something that you can speak with any factual basis about. And he said, well, yeah, it is, of course. He says, but we think we know who are the haters. So he even admitted to me that it's something which everybody should know, that it's subjective and it makes no sense. But again, the problem is that, as you explained, they've weaponized the term, and now the corrupt media, the mainstream media, is using it to silence critics of them and anyone else, unfortunately.
And that's exactly what this is all about, Dave. I love that phrase. They have weaponized that phrase. That's a great way of putting it. At the end of the day, that's what this is really all about. That's what political correctness is about. That's what the Southern Poverty Law Center is trying to do through the media and through everywhere that they can get a hearing, is they are trying to marginalize and ultimately silence Christians. If they can designate you as a hater, and we're now having a debate, again, in this country, we have a First Amendment, and on the left in America, it's now a very popular discussion. Does the First Amendment cover hate speech? And more people on the left are coming to the, I think, absurd conclusion that so-called hate speech, however you want to define that, is not covered by the First Amendment. And so if you can get someone designated as a hater and get their speech designated as hate speech, then you can say they're not covered by the First Amendment, and what can you do? You can have the government silence them. That is, at the end of the day, the goal here. It's to marginalize, for the purpose of ultimately silencing conservatives and Christians. And ultimately, this stuff has a cost associated with it as well. And what's amusing about it is they call, say, D. James Kennedy Ministries or the Family Research Council hate groups. And yet, and this will be news to some of your listeners and others will be familiar, it was the Southern Poverty Law Center's designation of the Family Research Council as a hate group that caused a homosexual activist to walk into the Family Research Council's headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 2012 and open fire with the intent on killing as many people at the Family Research Council as he could. Thankfully, a fast-acting building supervisor by the name of Leo Johnson saw when he pulled the gun out and wrestled with him and kept him from hurting anyone. Leo himself was shot in the arm, had to have several surgeries as a result of that. And the attacker was charged federally with a hate crime, with a terrorist attack. So you had a domestic terrorist. When police interviewed the man, his name is Floyd Corkins. When they asked him, why did you pick out the Family Research Council? He said, well, I found them on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. So here we have someone, a convicted terrorist now, who directly attributes the SPLC's hate map to his attack on the Family Research Council, a conservative Christian group. So who's the hate group here? Is it the Family Research Council that promotes a biblical view of marriage or sexuality, or is it the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose designation actually led to a terror attack at the Family Research Council? And yet we have this all completely turned upside down, and unfortunately, that's been one of the most undercovered stories of the past 10 years or so, this attack at the Family Research Council that took place back in 2012. So they have a vested interest in designating those that they disagree with as being haters, because if they can call them haters, they're also working to make sure that the First Amendment doesn't apply to them and they can silence them. And they don't want to only do it with the Ku Klux Klan or with neo-Nazis. They want to do it with conservatives and Christians as well.
Absolutely. Again, thank you, John. Yeah, many of the listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with this deranged Floyd Corkins who did that and how he did it. And, of course, as you mentioned, our great friends at the mainstream media brushed it under the rug. It wasn't something that fit in with their agenda.
That's right.
Your case is so important. I personally feel that there isn't a way for me to overemphasize the importance of it. Reining in this organization, which is completely out of control, bringing some sanity in the arena of allowing a private entity masquerading as some kind of an upholder of love to not be allowed to arbitrarily assign these designations, which can lead to, as you mentioned, violence and death. And this poor fella has already had a few surgeries. So thank goodness, like you said, he was quick-witted enough to do something, but he put himself in harm's way, and now he has to live with that decision where it's not easy having surgeries. A lot of people have had them. I've had them. It's a physical disability that gives you pain every day. You have to deal with it. And so here, the Southern Poverty Law Center, because they decided to label this particular fine group, the FRC, as a hate group, created misery and agony and pain for just one person, although there's a lot of people who have been affected by these, what a lot of folks refer to as shysters. But this is so important, and of course, things that are as important as this, they don't come free, obviously, and especially with a federal lawsuit. They're much, much, much more costly than a lawsuit waged on the local or the state level. So you have the, if I'm correct, the National Center for Life and Liberty out of Texas, David Gibbs III, representing you folks. Really, the most important thing I think here for me to say now is, how is it that the listeners could help you with this lawsuit?
Well, I appreciate that. And of course, just helping the word get out is certainly helpful. Letting people know what's going on out there and that we are pursuing this awareness is very important. And that's why I appreciate you having your program today as well, so that we can let people know about it. And it's always an uncomfortable thing, but as you said, these sorts of suits are not cheap. And thankfully, David does great work, and he's also a member of our board of directors. And so we are very appreciative for David Gibbs III and the work that he's doing for us. But if anyone feels feels led to help us with this, they can contribute. The easiest way of doing that is just by going to our website, djkm.org, and the information for donating is there as well. And we welcome prayer as well. We appreciate everybody who just stops and prays for us and recognizes that their own Christian is guaranteed under the First Amendment are endangered right now, and that this lawsuit, we feel like, has been a long time in coming, and it's a way of planting that flag to say thus far and no farther, that it's time to take a stand. And so we would ask people to be in prayer for us as well as we pursue this lawsuit. You know, I can tell you right now, Dave, we do not have a $300 million bank account at D. James Kennedy Ministries, not anywhere near it. And so this is a little bit of a David and Goliath type of situation. They are far, far larger than we are in terms of resources, in terms of their ability to just sort of overwhelm us with motions and with what lawyers call punitive discovery, where you just make frivolous discovery claims and so forth. So we are going to be up against it here. So anyone who feels led to help with that, we welcome that as well.
That's great, John. Thank you again for explaining that. And yeah, this is so important because they can do what you said and they will do it. And no, you don't have $300 million just sitting around. And especially, like you said, in the Cayman Islands, they don't even have it here in the United States. What kind of an organization is this? And I've been to that monstrosity in downtown Montgomery, Alabama. I don't know if you have, but it's quite a sight,
yes.
That building. They parked it right there in beautiful, historic downtown Montgomery, I guess, to make a statement. It certainly is an eyesore. And more importantly, they are a sore on society that needs to be corrected, because for myself, I'm very supportive of the First Amendment, although, of course, the First Amendment was created to apply to protect the states against the federal government, but of course each state has its own First Amendment. But here in this case, the stigma of being branded by this rogue organization really can create, as you mentioned and as I followed up with, lethal effects, unfortunately. And it's so important that you guys go out there and get the funds you need to present your case and hopefully come out on the winning end.
Just to touch on something that you mentioned, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a private organization, and so it's not the government. And you're right, the Southern Poverty Law Center calling us haters is slanderous, but it's not a violation of the First Amendment. But where the religious liberty concerns come in and the First Amendment concerns come in is that often law enforcement agencies have relied upon the SPLC's designations. The FBI has relied upon the SPLC's designations. And so government entities are taking these designations of highly ideological, far-left Southern Poverty Law Center at face value. There is a danger of that, and that's one of the reasons for this lawsuit as well, that the Southern Poverty Law Center cannot be allowed to damage people by making these false claims about them, and that the government cannot rely at face value upon the designations of this highly partisan group. And so it's part of a larger strategy that will ultimately threaten our First Amendment freedoms, designating people haters and trying to argue that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. If we understand anything about it, it was to protect dissenters. It is to protect unpopular speech. And so if it doesn't protect quote-unquote hate speech, whether it actually is hate speech or whether it's just something that someone falsely designates hate speech, if the First Amendment doesn't cover that, I don't know what it really does cover. And so this is ultimately an issue that we all need to take a stand on and to speak out on. And as a ministry, again, I would just say that we offer love. We offer redemption. We offer the love of Jesus, who can cleanse us and who can bring us forgiveness before God. Whether we're straight, whether we're homosexual, whether we're transgendered, whether we've been thieves, whether we've been murderers, God can bring that forgiveness and that redemption to anyone through Christ. And that's what we're ultimately about. And this is a matter of clearing out one of the impediments, one of the roadblocks to being able to share that message with people. That's really what it's all about.
Very, very well said, John. And let me just say the ministries are quite lucky to have somebody like you in the position you're in, or even just affiliated with them. Obviously, such an articulate, knowledgeable man. They're quite fortunate to have you there, John.
That's very kind of you, Dave. Thank you for saying that, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about what we do, about our concerns with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I was fortunate that I got to work directly with Dr. Kennedy for 5 or 6 years before his passing, and he was a great man, and I'm very blessed to be able to be a part of this organization. So thank you for saying that.
It's well deserved. John Rabe, the Director of Creative Production, on-air host for the D. James Kennedy Ministries. John, I want to thank you so much for the time you spent explaining all this to the listeners, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again real soon.
Sounds great, Dave. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.